Hi, everyone. I want to thank Diego and Frampton for inviting me here today. And as he said, my name is Elena Martinez. I do work in the Bronx mostly, which I'll get to because the presentation is about that. But I'm a folklorist. I've been a folklorist at City Lore for many years. And City Lore has a project called Place Matters, which for many years I did a lot of the work on. The project Place Matters is about looking, preserving and looking at community sites through the perspective of the community and how the community feels about places. So I'm coming to you today, not from the architecture and design world, from the preservation world. I don't know a lot about that. My background is more coming from getting stories from people. So in Place Matters, this project, when people from the community would nominate a place or site that they feel was important to their community, we would go out and interview people from the community and just collect their stories and build up these narratives about the sites through the stories and through the interviews from people. So that's where this project came from, Place Matters. And then I started doing a lot of work in the Bronx. And so all my Bronx work sort of grew out of this Place Matters project. And to start with, one of the first things, an early project, oops. Why am I missing? Sorry, problem there. Okay, so a project we did through Place Matters back in like 2001 was we wanted to nominate some sites to the National Register of Historic Places, but not looking at them from the idea of that they're building, qualities, but and their architectural features, but looking at them from the community, how their significance to the community. So there were 3 sites that we worked on. Bohemian Hall, you see there on the left. On the bottom, you see Kyler Church in Brooklyn, and these were chosen because of their relevance to the community. Bohemian Hall, an old beer hall for beer garden for the Czech community, but later a lot of other communities used it for different things. And Kyler Church was a very important site for the Mohawk community that made its home in Brooklyn in the mid 20th century. A lot of the Mohawks who had worked in the steel workers union. So they were 2 of the places that we had worked on, and the one that I worked on was you see it, was this building on the left, the Manhasset building in the Bronx. And we worked on that because inside that, as part of that building was Casa Amadeo, which you see on the other side. So Casa Amadeo is the longest continually run Latin music store in New York City. It's also the first site on the first Puerto Rican site on the mainland to be designated onto the National Register. And looking at the idea of cultural significance was really important for us. Why did the community like this? For us, not only has it this great thing, it's the longest continually run Latin music store since 1941 when it was established in that building. The idea of them, we're looking at buildings and sites, not just for their architectural features, but that they are repositories of stories, or they are that people in the community might look at them and they trigger stories, they trigger history, they help us learn about the history of the people who lived in that community. So this Casa Amadeo, this record store, tells you really, if you listen to the people who, the owner of it now, know the story of the woman who ran it before, follows the story of Puerto Rican migration to New York City, from East Harlem to the Bronx. The Puerto Rican women who worked in the garment industry, because the woman who founded the store worked in the garment industry and sold clothes actually in that store in 1941 when she opened it, as well as music. The current owner bought it in 1969 and kept it going to the fires when all those apartments no one was in them except a few squatters in the 1980s. He kept that building, he kept his store alive by getting water from the pump, and just, at night, making sure no one, broke into the store, staying there. So this building holds a story of what the Puerto Rican community did. The original owner coming up from East Harlem with a store there, moving into the Bronx in the 1940s, which a lot of other Puerto Ricans started doing after World War I. And then, being an early woman entrepreneur, and so it just tells this larger story. If it's not just, that it's a record store, a little humble record store, right? That's part of this building. And also, of course, as a music store, the Bronx has a really strong Latin music, all kinds of music, but a strong Latin music history. And of all the different sites that were part of the Bronx, this incredible scene that were in the 40s, 50s, 60s, that were part of the Bronx, all these theaters and nightclubs. Casa Amadeo is really the only one that's still standing from that era as a record store and part of that music scene. So again, so it holds a lot of history for the community. It's still there. It was nominated to the National Register in 2000, well, State Register first and then National Register in 2003, along with Kyler Church and Bohemian Hall. So we were really happy to be able to get something on the National Register that did deal with cultural significance. Not really, that building, the Manhasset, has some interesting qualities, but really the reason it was on the National Register was because of the store. Just indoors, inside with the owner, Miguel Angel Amadeo, Mike Amadeo, who's still there, who himself is a great composer, very important composer for the Puerto Rican community. He's written songs for Celia Cruz, El Gran Combo, Hector Lavoe. If you're interested in Latin music, all those names will be familiar with you. I do, because of the work I did for Place Matters, I started doing some walking tours in East Harlem and the South Bronx about the musical and artistic legacy of those places. And so I come across a lot of these different sites while I'm doing the walking tours in Longwood, Hunts Point, those neighborhoods, Morrisania. And theaters are also a really important site. Or sites in the Bronx. There's tons of them, I'm sure, all through the city. There's tons of these old theaters that were built in the 20s and 30s in these construction booms. These are some of the sites that are still there. You know, in the Bronx, we were affected by the fires. We've lost so many interesting places, sites because of the fires and other things. But you have some of these theaters that still remain there. This is the Star on sort of the corner of Longwood and Westchester. You can, an older photo, you can see it there, and on the bottom you can see what it looks like now. A lot of these theaters have become churches, actually. Weirdly enough, oddly enough, for whatever reason, a lot of the theaters have become churches. And again, like some of the other buildings we mentioned, these are catalysts for stories. They also tell the history of the different immigrant groups that move through these neighborhoods. A lot of these theaters. This is the Boulevard Theater, now Planet Fitness on Southern Boulevard. But you can see an ad for a movie that was there. Again, a lot of these theaters tell the history of the immigrants that lived in these communities and the people who lived in the communities. Some of them started out as a Jewish catering hall. Some of them started out as vaudeville theaters for the Irish community. Then the Puerto Rican community moves in, and they're not. They're not. It's not the Boulevard Theater anymore. It's Teatro Boulevard, because the Puerto Rican community is in there now, Spanish speaking, and they show Spanish speaking movies. Later on, they start showing concerts and the musicians who were the big musicians of the day, from Tito Puente, Mongo Santa Maria. So they sort of are places that have all this history embedded inside them. This is the Spooner Theater. The one on the part on the left, which was the Spooner Theater. It's been through many things now, like a store, a Duanery, different things. But it's one of those sites, at least it's still there. We can walk by it and look at it and remember it. For the musical, it has an incredible musical history. Johnny Pacheco did a lot there. Charlie Palmieri. So people in the neighborhood remember going to these places. So they're really important reminders of that legacy, that artistic and musical legacy of the Bronx. Because again, the Bronx gets a bad reputation, but we are very proud of the Bronx, and we can, those of us who live in the Bronx are very proud and can look back at these sites that hold all those stories for us. This is one of the most famous ones, Teatro Puerto Rico. Again, that was the Forum Theater, but once Puerto Rican communities started coming in the post-World War II into the area, it became Teatro Puerto Rico. One of the probably hottest spots. Everyone has stories. Every musician from that era has stories about playing there. It was the spot. A lot of people might know in the African-American community, they call the Chitlin Circuit, what musicians and comedians would follow. This was the Cuchifrito Circuit, and this was the hottest spot on the Cuchifrito Circuit. If you were coming in, and Mexican movies, it was the height of the Mexican movie era, the golden age of Mexican cinema. So they had Mexican movies there. They'd have actors from Mexico and musicians from Mexico, all the ones from Puerto Rico. And then these were really, Christmas shows where new people who are just coming from the island, new migrants from Puerto Rico, might be settling in this neighborhood, want to hear the sounds of their homeland. You could go and hear the music from Puerto Rico there. So these were very important spots for the community. And also the Bronx Opera House, which many of you might know that it's recently in the past few years become the Bronx Opera House Hotel. But actually in between with the Bronx Opera House, around 1913, whenever that opened up, it was a major Latin music venue as well, the Caravana Club, major venue, the Caravana Club, and later called the Bronx Casino, before it became a church. and then it stopped for a while, and they've taken it over and it's become the Bronx Opera House Hotel. So so again, you just see the the neighborhood changing, and they might be telling the news story now, the Bronx too, the center of gentrification. And what tells you more about gentrification than maybe a boutique hotel moving right into your neighborhood. So so again, these sites again show the progression of who's lived there, what's been going on there. This building here is an interesting building. I was, it's one of those sort of like gridiron looking buildings. I was walking with someone from the Garifuna community by there, and he just stopped and told me, he goes, this is, we call that building the Wapuro building. Wapuro in Garifuna means ship, because that building looks like a ship, and many in the community felt it looked like a ship. And when I said, well, why did you call it that? Obviously not just from the looks, but many Garifuna, you're familiar with the Garifuna community from Honduras, Belize, Nicaragua, who settled in New York City. A lot of them were merchant marines. So ships and that, a lot of that plays a big part in the settlement of the Garifuna community here in the middle part of the 20th century. So they, Wapuro, it's still, people call it that. The park next to it, Rainy Park, is called Wapuro Park. That's where people know to meet. And this became a really hot spot also after a lot of the Garifuna community was located over in Crotona Park, more like that neighborhood. But and that's where the Happy Land fire happened in 1993. And that really devastated, because, like 2/3 of the Happy Land fire were members of the Garifuna, Honduran and Garifuna community. And so that really tore the community apart. So a lot of them moved from that area by Crotona Park and came over more to this neighborhood by Prospect Avenue. So it holds a special part of that history for that community. Just want to point out Maxine Sullivan's home. The Bronx. We think of jazz history. Harlem, 52nd Street, St. Albans, and Queens. There's actually by Boston Road a big jazz history in the Bronx as well. And again, a lot of the big great clubs aren't there anymore. But Maxine Sullivan was this vocalist who came and settled in the Bronx to raise her family, and that's her home. And it is still there. So it's one of these interesting places that's actually still there. And I just want to end with casitas. So casitas are we're all over New York City in places where there's Puerto Rican communities. A lot of them are gone, but in the Bronx, there's still a concentration of a lot of casitas in the Melrose neighborhood. And actually, the very first one, like one of the original casita that goes back to the mid-1970s, was built by Chema Soto, Rincon Criollo, which was as you see on the top, that was the original site on the top slide. But because they had there was an issue there. These were like community gardens. They're squatted on, right? People just built their gardens or built these casitas. If you were a Puerto Rican gardener, you usually built a casita on your garden. And that area was contested. That lot was contested for affordable housing. So they had to move, but the community made sure they were able to move up a few blocks away on 157th and Brook, and they created the one on the bottom. So that casita is still there. It's the oldest, the casita. Chema Soto, who created that, went on to help build some of the other casitas in the neighborhood. And which, right now, actually, City Law is working on a project to get it on the National Register as a traditional. The traditional designation. I'm spacing on that right now, but so we're trying to do it, but it's very hard because the National Register has very architectural standards, and there's very specific things. You have to be 50 years. You have to have certain sorts of criteria, but those criteria don't really matter to the community. What matters is that this casita is the original one that community members built, because in the 1970s, when everything was falling apart, that was a lot with glass and needles on it, but the community members got together and said, we're going to build something for our kids to have green space, and it's become actually not only also a center of traditional Puerto Rican music. If you are from the island of Puerto Rico and you like the music of bomba, the music of plena, this has become sort of like a cultural center where everyone comes to come to this casita to hear that music. There's always music going on there. And I just want to this is a Bon Plenazo. It's a very big festival that happens every other year at Ostos Community College to celebrate traditional Puerto Rican music. And the casita is so important to it that you can see it's part of the poster that was for one of the Bon Plenazos. So again, this holds relevance. It might not hold relevance in terms of architectural significance or what the standards are for criteria of that, but for the community, this is one of the most important spaces of Puerto Rican culture, keeping Puerto Rican culture alive in the Bronx right now. So that's it. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I apologize. I think I'm going next. And I hope you can hear me because,
yes, we can.
Okay, thanks. I'm Shannon Garrison. Apologies, I can't be with you. Today I am zooming in from South Philadelphia, where I work as a preservation planner with the Philadelphia Historical Commission. I'm going to assume I can share my screen maybe to share my presentation.
Yes.
Okay. That option actually just went away for me. Hold on. I am sorry. Frampton, I'm sorry. I used to have a share screen option at the top of my Zoom, and it is no longer coming up.
All right, just hold on a second.
Yeah, apologies. It is still not there. Okay, I'm being told to log in or log out and log back in. Maybe it makes sense for the other panelists to present, and I will try and be back to you guys soon with the presentation.
Should Jerome go next? Is that preferable? Okay. So I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Jerome Haferd.
Okay, so do you have my slides? I'm just going to use this to develop my notes. Yeah, that's. And so I click next here. This guy. Do I have to hit something here? Yes, thank you. Okay, great. All righty. We're multimodal today. Can everyone hear me? Okay. And was I introduced already?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm reintroducing Jerome Haferd.
So you kind of know who I am. I might be a little bit. My name's Jerome Haferd. I'm an architect, also a public artist and academic. So this talk, we have a short amount of time. So I sort of erred on the side of putting some more maybe general concepts out there, in particular about some sites in Harlem, but also a related site in the Hudson Valley, instead of going into maybe a deep, exhaustive dive into either of those sites. So it sort of puts some ideas on the table that may be slightly more esoteric, I don't know, but I hope.
Jerome, sorry, I think if you can pull the mic down a little bit, I think people.
Oh, hello, is that better? Okay, is that better? Is this the one? Can you hear me better? No?
There. try that again.
I can just yell. Okay, there we go. Aha. Okay, wonderful. So I'll just jump into it. This work is, in a way, I've been sort of speculating and thinking about how these sites, what they sort of provoke for architects and our discipline. And I think that we can have a conversation about that. So this is just a kind of overview collage slide of my practice, which I was mentioning is a kind of expanded practice. I have a professional studio doing built work, which also kind of feeds research and publications, and then feeds into stakeholder engagement and academic work, primarily at City College in Columbia, which also then feeds into sort of on the ground activism and direct engagement with, in particular, descendant communities and youth, attempting to sort of generate new design work for some sites that I'm going to talk about briefly. I gotta get my notes here. So as an architect, urban designer, and educator, I'm primarily concerned with how historically marginalized subjectivities and spaces really reorient our discipline and the way we think about architecture in particular and urban design, and how in turn that begins to inform other modes and values for practice, which directly connect back to how we teach architecture, how we think through a kind of paradigm of architecture from maybe a sort of static object to perhaps a set of policies or more kind of active time-based thinking, which I think the previous speaker was sort of getting at, right? And furthermore, so to build on that statement, I'm interested in specific context. This is an image in the middle and right of Kingston, New York, and histories which are typically overlooked in my mainstream discipline for reasons typically related to maybe race, historical dispossession, or erasure of the archive of these sites, or simply a lack of representation of folks to speak to that within architecture or urban design. And to take that further, that sites such as this, we're seeing on the left then a cropped image of the Harlem African Burial Ground site juxtaposed with this Kingston site, that these sites and built environments, even if they have been mostly erased, that is in particular of, say, maybe African-American, indigenous, or marginalized history, that they might unlock a new kind of disciplinary imaginary. And that's one of kind of different aesthetics or ethics or ideas of how to repair that are fundamental to these sites, or of even ideas of sort of new ideas of property ownership, new kind of speculative notions of civic and cultural infrastructure. And this is a speculative student project on the screen, et cetera. These are just some images of my work that are kind of tracking. And in particular in Harlem, where I live and practice between Harlem and the Hudson Valley. This is an aerial view of one of the more critical geographies of my practice for the first 5 to 8 years of my work, which is Marcus Garvey Park. Many of you are probably familiar with this park. I've done a lot of, I've worked with Angel Ayon in this park around the Fire Watchtower, but also sort of initiated public art to build awareness around the various histories in this site. And this is one of those pieces. So in those early installations, working with community organizations, but also less formal groups in the park, historic groups like the Drum Circle, we were really creating space-taking proposals, but also kind of rehearsing under a sort of latent archive of this space and thinking about that Fire Watchtower, but also of sort of histories, oral histories, spoken word, speeches that had been given near or around that site, that in this piece, which was titled Sejour, we sort of had playing 24/7 as a kind of soundtrack in the space to sort of conjure some of those figures who are really important to this sort of landscape. So this question that I've been asking myself, and maybe some of you are in this panel, is really how do we excavate these overlooked histories to engage landscapes and the built environment in service of liberatory practice? So how do we attribute agency to these descendant groups or communities attempting to do this work and make sure that new design proposals are sort of embedding different values into how we might reimagine these sites that are kind of new construction. And so for me, this begins with really this kind of audit of architecture of my discipline, which I'm going to talk a little bit about now. And that's basically this kind of sort of critical acknowledgement of grappling with history on specific sites that has to do with, in a way, that how the suppression of certain histories and sites really expose some kind of professional or disciplinary blind spots. That is, what is being left out and unconsidered when we're producing the built environment, or for example, recognizing historic traits of buildings or attempting to get them listed on historic registrars, et cetera. And really, how do we begin to acknowledge that these are living histories that are still with us and not kind of past tense? And I think the previous speaker was sort of getting at that. So these are just a selection of slides and articles that are looking at these two African burial ground sites that I'm going to briefly talk about. One is the Pine Street African Burial Ground in Kingston, New York. The other is the Harlem African Burial Ground in East Harlem, which some of you may be aware of. And so for me, this began kind of close to home, and how my work in Harlem led to a deeper research and inquiry into these sites of, in particular, African-American and indigenous erasure. The Harlem African Burial Ground, which is, the map is shown here above, really became this project of research and also teaching with young people, and then outreach into the community conducted around this site. And what I learned about this sort of forgotten site, I live a few blocks away from this site, you know, and thinking is that the proposed redevelopment and memorialization of this site, I was really provoked to lead a kind of design studio with young people and for them to speculate on what does it mean to produce a living memorial and also have other kind of more residential, civic, and cultural programs all together on the same site. How do we even do that in this context, right? And ultimately also produce research and scholarship around this question. And so this is an image of the artist Abigail DeVille, who was sort of preempting some of the kind of ambition to redevelop this site and also rezone this entire neighborhood. It's a major ongoing rezoning and development area in the city. East 125th Street is just a construction site for any of you who live up there. But really has been, as you go further east, this kind of forgotten, environmentally degraded territory, right? That locals have been sort of aware of, but even the kind of local memory around this site is somewhat fragmented. And so I quickly realized that trying to meaningfully engage this site requires us to kind of open up new ways of understanding history, because the archive is quite lacking in terms of really a kind of repository of formal information. And this is essential to kind of creatively and ethically generating new concepts and forms of architecture and urban design that will not duplicate the sort of harms that have resulted in the kind of environmental and sort of human archival violence on this site, but that have resulted in the degradation of the landscape, but also the loss of agency of the inhabitants and sort of community around this site. So for example, looking at the 2050 flood map, which is a kind of future projection, nonetheless indexes a kind of original edge of the Harlem River here, a kind of prehistory of the site that was a Lenape trading ground at the edge of the water, and also then a kind of shared communal farming territory by the very early residents of the village of Harlem, okay? And so really examining the physical and political layers of the ground, including the kind of legal structures and codes, and finally speculating on what forms of community may have flourished here before the commissioner's grid of Manhattan came north, helped to start to understand the new environmental and cultural imaginaries for restoring the water's edge in this case, but also proposing kind of living memorials and kind of residential civic programs here. And so this is a view of the kind of the MTA bus depot, which is still currently on the site, really right over top of this sort of large African burial ground site. And so these are just a couple slides from the Harlem African Burial Ground Task Force's website that sort of show an aerial view of kind of what is at stake here through this proposed development by the EDC, is to really take that entire block and convert it into a sort of mixed use development, including commercial, cultural, living memorial, public space, and mixed income housing. So how does one do that? How does the sort of presence of those programs on this site provoke a different way of thinking about design, and how a living memorial might kind of pervade even into those other programs, is what I've been asking myself. And so these are just some historical maps of that original Lenape path, trading path, which sort of culminated at that space along the water. And so I really introduced into this research, scholars such as Marisa Fuentes and Saidia Hartman, who are experimental historians. And Fuentes in particular, who was dealing with also kind of resuscitating the subjectivities and the histories of, in particular, enslaved women in Barbados, who, I'm gonna have to go faster, who said that she had to learn to really look to other disciplines and speak the language of other disciplines in order to kind of re-image those subjects, including the languages of, say, geography or architecture. And I was really taken with how in this case, a historian's work becomes an imagination process. I had never really thought about how imagination is so critical to sort of pushing a discipline like history further, and maybe even historic preservation, or how we build on these sites. And I'm just going to go a little bit faster here. And so while historians primarily deal with written records, architecture and landscape, and this is, I'm showing now some images of speculative student proposals for that site that you'll see just kind of tracking. Architecture and landscape perform archival work through their ability to memorialize and or negate the past, present, and future of their surroundings. In this sense, architecture is not only a tool with archival power, but an archival project in and of itself. Therefore, might we consider ways that cultural memory is maintained and preserved in mediums other than written text? Okay, so there was a series of other buildings that have sort of superimposed onto this site since its original sort of use. The Hearst, there was a Hearst publishing building here. There was an entertainment complex. We were talking about entertainment buildings. There was a military barracks. So there have been all of these different architectures which kind of affect the sort of memory of this site. In mediums other than written text, including buildings, landscapes, but also oral tradition, performances, and civic life that happened on the site, social behaviors, and of course, the ground itself. So you're seeing on the right-hand side, and I'll show more images of this, these students were interested in how do we begin to maybe rethink what a typical ground plane is of a site like this, and allow the river to perhaps re-infiltrate to its original boundary and have a more kind of holistic relationship to the site, which right now has this kind of flood, this sort of flood condition. And this is in dialogue with other living memorials. You know, many of you know the living memorial in Alabama. And so these are some images of that student work, which begin to try to think, okay, how does the living memorial perhaps infiltrate or pervade the entire site and kind of transcend an idea of a memorial as a sort of single static object, but rather a kind of series of provocations that affect not only the built form, but also the entire site, but even sort of policies and frameworks for occupying that landscape. Oh, am I not going ahead here? Oh, I am going ahead. Someone's doing that for me, I think, because I'm not so good at it. So these are just some really speculative images that these young people did, thinking about even the kind of, again, the really immersing ourselves in the water there. I'll just go quickly. This led to a series of other studios. Here's some more. This was a student project for the Harlem site where they really thought about trees as having kind of archival agency. So they proposed a kind of grove of trees, but also a kind of communal garden, which would be throughout the entire site. So there would be a sort of stewardship that would almost enact a living memorial amidst all of these different programs and not a kind of single location on the site. And then I'll very quickly, and so here are some images of that. And because I'm out of time, this is a clip of the stakeholders of the Reverend Patricia Singletary. She's from the descendant community up there, the Elmdorf Church. Also Marisa Fuentes, the historian herself, and other architects and students at that presentation of those projects, which also were presented to the then Commissioner of Culture and also kind of other community leaders up here in Harlem who have been working on this site. And then I'll just track very quickly through these images of a kind of second iteration of that work, which has been happening up in Kingston, New York, where a similar situation of a kind of forgotten African burial ground, but in this case, in a residential area, in a sort of neighborhood block, is part of this sort of youth community design effort to propose a sort of living memorial, but that living memorial in this case is kind of traversing multiple people's property. So what do you do in that case, right? It's sort of, it means we have to kind of think a little bit differently about kind of sharing that space and maybe even a kind of series of covenants, or these are kind of really futuristic scenarios, or new kind of agreements of how this might provoke a new thinking of in this case, low density urbanism around the kind of memorialization of that site. And I think I will maybe stop it there. And this is an image of the latest image of that effort up there in Kingston, where they've restored the house that was kind of all this while on top of that burial ground site. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jerome.
Where do I go now?
Oh, you can sit here, yes. We'll have our final presentation. Shannon is back with us.
Hello. Okay. I am requesting remote control. I don't know that I have it, but here we go. Let's see. Yeah, continue. I think we got it. All right. Are you all seeing this?
Yes.
Yay. I'm sorry. Okay. So my name is Shannon Garrison, again, from Philadelphia. I work at the Philadelphia Historical Commission, and I co-manage the city's Cultural Resources Survey and Pilot Project. And I'm just going to spend the next 10 minutes walking you through our planning process and discussing some of the things we've learned so far and a few of the challenges that we're working through when it comes to documenting and regulating cultural resources. And I will apologize off the bat. This is a text-heavy presentation. You're not going to see a lot of charismatic pictures of Philadelphia. You're going to have to get on the train and come down and visit us here to see those sites. But that's partially because as a city agency, when we started this project,
there's nothing on the screen. I don't know if there's, it disappeared.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Clapped too soon.
Let me try this again.
We can see you.
You can see me. Did you ever see you did see the presentation for a second?
Yes, it's back.
Okay. You know, as I was just giving this like disclaimer, if it happens again, I can just talk you through some of these issues because, you know, this is something that a lot of the challenges that we're working through as a city agency are in part, how do you identify cultural resources in the city, but then also how do you regulate them? Because essentially the Historical Commission is a regulatory agency. So before we jump into that, just a little background. This survey came out of the mayor's call for a historic preservation task force in 2017. That was a response to an unprecedented number of demolitions that resulted from the adoption of a new zoning code. And one of the key recommendations of that task force was that the city conduct a survey to identify historic and cultural assets. So in February of 2020, the city was awarded a $250,000 grant from the William Penn Foundation. And that was to explicitly conduct a survey that was focused on intangible heritage, with the deliverables being to hire a team of consultants to develop a survey methodology focused on cultural resources, and then to conduct a pilot project to test that methodology in the field. So, of course, we all know what happened in March of 2020. And so a planning process that we initially envisioned would take maybe 5 or 6 months has since stretched out to well over a year. And during that time, we were readjusting to our new virtual lives and also really reevaluating this cultural resources survey project and how to progress in the wake of the pandemic, of the murder of George Floyd, of the civil uprisings of the summer of 2020. And in October of 2020, we hired a consultant to help us write a request for proposals to hire a group of consultants to conduct the survey. So if that sounds like the most bureaucratic way to do things, I admit I too felt that way when I started. But really, the William Penn Foundation emphasized that we take time, and as much time as we needed, thankfully, at the beginning, to really plan this project out. And we took that time, and it was, I will say, essential. I think it's going to have been essential to the success of the survey, in that when we started to interview RFP consultants, we realized immediately that we had a problem that we needed to address from the start. So to back up a little, the Philadelphia Historical Commission is made up of 6 people currently. We are all white. 4 out of the 6 of us have graduated from the exact same preservation program. And when we started to interview consultants, we realized that we were interviewing and talking to a lot of people that looked like us, who had experiences and expertise that replicated a lot of our experiences and expertise. And so we kind of hit pause for a second to think whether or not that was going to result in a successful reflection of the culture of Philadelphia. So we, in December 2020, hired a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. Then we assembled an internal advisory team made up of representatives from different city agencies to think through some of these problems from the very beginning, before we even hired our survey consultant team, and to kind of rework the process. And so we decided to ask for potential survey consultants to submit qualifications in May of 2021. And then in September of 2021, when we finally did release our RFP for the Cultural Survey Resources pilot project itself, we then asked everybody that had been qualified as a qualified candidate to engage in team building exercises, because we really wanted to see and to hire a team that was dedicated to a process that was inclusive and involved voices that were not normally at the table when it comes to preservation in the city. In February 2022, we hired a consultant team. And just last month, 2 years after we started, we actually have kicked off the project. And this summer, we will be sort of publicly kicking off the Cultural Resources Survey project. So you might be wondering what took so long and what were we really doing during that time? And I would say that one of the most important things that we did was develop a set of values and principles to really ground this Cultural Resources Survey. And those you see here: analyzing power, throughout the project, learning from failures past and present, maintaining flexibility, adapting to problems, being transparent and accountable, and moving at the speed of trust. And establishing this list has been a crucial way of keeping us honest and accountable about the survey project, both to ourselves and to the public. And another major thing we did is we rethought what the project goals were. From the outset, William Penn and the planning department did not want a traditional historic preservation survey, one that focused on architectural integrity. However, knowing what you don't want a project to be is very different from identifying and articulate what you want a project to accomplish. And so a lot of the planning we've been doing behind the scenes has been really thinking and trying to express to other people what the real goals of this cultural resources survey are. And you see some of the main ones here, and these weren't necessarily the ones that we started with. And, this cultural resources survey should not only identify culturally significant spaces, sites, or events, it needs to transform how the Philadelphia Historical Commission interacts with the public. We need to build relationships with communities so that they trust us enough to share their culture with us, and that they want to work with us to preserve and protect it in ways that are meaningful to them. And then lastly, we spent a lot of the time rethinking, as I said earlier, the whole request for proposal process and reworking it in an attempt to make it more equitable and encourage people outside traditional fields of preservation, planning, and architectural history to apply and work on the survey. So ultimately, we think the process was pretty successful in that we interviewed 3 qualified teams of consultant candidates, and we hired an incredible group with a wealth of experience in community engagement. And I will just back up and say that that was another sort of rethinking of the project, is that we knew that the thing that we are not trained as preservationists at doing, and that the Historical Commission does not currently do, is community engagement. And so when we released our RFP, we were very clear that we needed the team to be equally as strong in community engagement as in preservation and survey work. And so we think, the team we hired, that was one of the main reasons, if not the main reason to hire them, is that they were very strong in engagement and relationship building and advocacy. And ultimately, all of this planning, the DEI work, has really made this project a lot better, which is not to say that we don't still face challenges. Or that we have, a lot of answers to the best way to go about preserving cultural resources and, again, regulating them. There's a lot of people, both internally and externally, that have questions and concerns. We can get into some of those. I think a lot of those questions internally revolve around the issue of regulation. And if we're not designating buildings, or if we're designating buildings for cultural resources, does regulating their windows and making them have historic windows, does that make sense? What role do we as an agency play in those sites? Are we, by de-emphasizing architectural history, are we, putting important buildings in parts of the city that haven't been surveyed at risk? That's something we've been hearing from the preservation community. So those are all questions that are important ones, and that conversation is happening. But ultimately, the field of preservation is changing. It needs to change, and the city of Philadelphia believes that we have something to offer to communities that want to protect the things that matter to them, and taking the time to listen, to build trust, and to work through some of these complicated issues together will make us as preservationists and as cities better and stronger. So with that, this is just a timeline moving forward. And thank you all for having me.
Thank you, Shannon.
Really important, that it's stories that need to be told in places that need to be remembered and recognized. So I think maybe just thinking the criteria a little bit differently for community-based things.
Yeah, I thought the casita example is really fantastic to bring up a lot of those issues. I was thinking similarly, which I hope I touched on when I was speaking, that really structurally there's kind of issues built into the sort of methods of sort of preservation and legalization and protection that I think, you know, maybe need to be expanded to acknowledge other qualities or other kind of capacities that are not built into the structures, like a certain amount of time, certain kinds of architectural significance we recognize, we understand is legible to legal bodies. Other kinds of architectural qualities are not legible to sort of lawmaking bodies or historic preservation bodies. So I think expanding our vocabulary and then building a capacity with these communities to sort of speak these languages of preservation. I think that's, as an architect, that's often the sort of the issue, is that you have communities who are up against sort of the language of, say, zoning or preservation or development. And it's a pretty arcane language, right? I mean, so this is kind of obvious, but really people embedded to kind of bridge those gaps is really important. Oh, and then I think this is maybe, I think this is also kind of critical. You know, different kinds of archival languages, right? We have, you know, what kinds of documents? What if there are no documents? So how do we create legal structures and codes and preservation codes when the sort of archive surrounding something is maybe less of a formal or kind of traditional archive?
So I'll open it up to the floor if anybody, we have time for a few questions. I will let you know that Shannon unfortunately has dropped off the call due to the webinar expiring. So we can't have any questions for her, but if you have any questions for Jerome or Elena, I'm happy to entertain those. Yes. No? Okay, go ahead.
First of all, Elena, congrats on your presentation. I think this is my first time here.
Not yet.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Elena, I had to congratulate what your presentation did. This is my first presentation that in my 40 years of professional experience, I hear something very deep and very profound. That lead me to believe at the reinforce the cultural aspect of the low-income families that basically all Latinos suffer. And I think it will reinforce that part. It will reinforce the quality of life and a poor conception of the minorities. I think you bring character with these points in that issue. And I think I'm going to finish with that. I think you had to work in the architectural part because there is a crime in the Bronx. I'm seeing beautiful buildings to destroy, buildings that belong in Park Avenue, but even better in some of the cases, but it has been demolished. I think you had to work in that direction. And thank you so much for your words, for your work that you did. Nice, well done, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think it's just important too, because the Bronx does have, really, I think still to this day, where the Bronx has this reputation that, the fires, the crime, people are still scared to come there sometimes, so I think it's sort of like, it's still 40 years later, there's still this sort of like reputation, but, it is great to make sure that the casitas and these other buildings that are there, that people can have some pride in their community, and they should have pride about that. So something to work towards.
And Shannon has rejoined us, so yes, Victoria?
I wanted to ask about that, the celebration at the casita. When is that?
The Bon Plenazo is every 2 years, and it's in the fall. And I think it was last fall. So the next one will be 2 years. But BOMPLENAZO. It's sponsored through Ostos Community College, but it always ends with a big jam session at the casita. Because literally, even the people who practice this form of music on the island know that if you are part of this scene, and if you have to come to New York and go to the casita, like it's just sort of the place where all of it happens. Like so, this little humble little spot in the Bronx, community garden with a little built, homemade built little house on it is sort of like the scene for this like music all across the island as well as the country. People from the West Coast, Bay Area, people come to that spot.
Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
First of all, an excellent deep dive on areas that I think we don't look at. So thank you for putting this in the program. I had a question for Shannon. Municipal governments aside, it was a very idealistic endeavor you started, but how did you get the financial tie-in and the patience for municipal leaders to support what at first seemed a short-term project, but obviously took a little longer? Governments tend to ebb and flow. And how did you manage to keep everybody's eye on that final project?
That's a good question. I think the William Penn Foundation has been very generous with the timeline. I think that because we did we started the project basically when everything was shutting down, that kind of bought us everybody's goodwill in taking more time than we would, I think, ordinarily have been allowed. But through that process of taking time, I think, and through having conversations with different people, we realized that is actually like taking time is going to be one of the most important things about this project. So one of our values and principles is moving at the speed of trust. You can't rush trust. We have the Historical Commission hasn't been in certain places. So we can't just go in and say, well, we've got 3 years to do this, that's how long we'll be here, and expect to have people trust us when we say, no, but don't worry, we'll continue after the fact. So we've kind of explained both to other agencies and to colleagues within the planning department that we're very much going, as part of the survey process, going to be leaning in because we want it to last past this pilot. This is the new way that the Historical Commission, we think, should be doing business. And that means that you can't really put a timeline on it or a time limit, and some people accept that and they kind of get it. And other people sort of are worried, and I think rightly so, that is there going to be anything left to preserve if you take all this time? But I think just being honest and asking for it has been a really important part of the project so far.
Do we have any final question? Yes.
Thank you all very much. And I'd like to put in a plug for education, particularly K through 12 and field trips. People aren't familiar with the community where they live, or they may know it for a specific thing, like you buy something somewhere, but not put it in any kind of historic perspective. So I know field trips are tough, but we're talking here about local field trips that don't even necessarily require buses or going to Philadelphia if you're in New York to see what's the Liberty Bell or Washington, D.C., but just walking around your own neighborhoods differently than you would if you're playing or biking or going shopping with your parents. So I realize that involves education, curriculum, schools, a whole nother area to get bogged down in. That's not so easy to change. But I think if we can introduce some of these concepts at the earlier ages, when the time I get to your classes in college, they'll have known this stuff for 10 years and they'll be ready to produce new ways of thinking about their own communities that they want to preserve.
Thank you so much. And I'd like again to thank Jerome, Shannon, Elena for this panel, and thank all of you for participating today. We look forward to, as I said earlier this morning, this is just the beginning of conversations around these issues, and we look forward to carrying these conversations forward with you. We recorded today, we'll be putting on our website, so please, please share that with your networks. And we'll be continuing programs throughout the summer and fall, including our walking tours and other programs around these topics. So look forward to continuing this conversation.